what we're going to do this morning is have a look at these pretty dramatic events, aren't they? The US strike on Syria and potentially what happens next. And I'm going to try and prove to you that the Bible talks exactly about these events that we're looking at now. And for probably I've been doing that weekly World Watch since 2003, and I was looking back, over the years to see when I first started thinking that America might well launch some sort of military aggression in Syria that would impact Russia, because that's really what's happening, isn't it? And it was in 2012, 2013 that I started talking about that, so it's now nearly 4 years ago. So I'm really excited about this, because I know it's all horrible, because we're going to look at terrifying events really, but all of it is written there in the Bible for us as an indication of what?
The return of Christ.
The return of Jesus. That's the point. So let me just play you a little video. I think this is from an Australian news organisation, but it seemed to summarise this situation that happened this week pretty well. So let's just have a watch of this. It lasts a couple of minutes.
From under the cover of darkness, launched from warships in the Mediterranean, a barrage of missiles in a surprise attack. 6 years into the Syrian war, and America makes its first direct assault. The trigger, this week's chemical attacks.
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched.
59 Tomahawks were fired at 3:45 a.m. local time from destroyers the USS Porter and USS Ross, targeting Syria's Al-Sharat airbase, 120 kilometres from where those chemical attacks occurred. The chemical blitz killed at least 72 people and injured hundreds more, including children. Autopsies have confirmed a nerve agent was used, probably sarin. It left the victims in agony, paralysed, frothing at the mouth. President Trump was deeply shocked by the images.
No child of God should ever suffer such horror.
The world condemnation was near universal.
It's a serious matter. It requires a serious response.
And critically, it moved Mr. Trump to reverse a long-standing US position against involvement.
This is our breaking news, the first video of U.S. military strikes.
The president had hinted action was imminent yesterday on board Air Force One.
I think what happened in Syria is a disgrace to humanity. And he's there, and I guess he's running things. So something should happen.
The attack killed at least 4 Syrian soldiers, including a general, and took out a dozen hangars, a fuel depot, and air defences.
It was a crime that called out for a swift response. And today the United States has responded.
The Tomahawk cruise missiles, almost 3 metres long, fly low at 1,000 kilometres an hour, cost $750,000 each. They are the US weapon of choice to attack from safe distances. But there are grave implications now for Allied military in and over Syria.
Right, and later on we're going to have a look at the end of that news clip, because it then starts talking about the implications of what is now happening in Syria with regards to, well, which nation do you think they start focusing on? Who's mainly impacted? Russia. Okay. So we're going to have a think about these events. We're going to have a think about it from a Russia-America point of view. Where does it say in the Bible about these things? Well, let me ask you. Where does it say in the Bible about Russia? Ezekiel is a good answer. Ezekiel 38 is even more accurate answer. You see, you move from father-in-law to son. There we are. Even more accurate. So we're going to have a look at Ezekiel 38. So let's just have a quick look at Ezekiel 38. I know we've looked at it many times, but I'm just going to try and quickly piece a few things together. So Ezekiel 38, it's a really key chapter because it talks about the time when a large nation, which I'm going to show you in a second is definitely Russia, comes all the way down with a massive army and with other nations as well, and descends into which country? Well, eventually it gets to Egypt, but Israel is the key bit. Where does it say in Ezekiel 38 that they come down into Israel? Which verse?
Verse 8.
Verse 8 is the first time. So it says, after many days you'll be visited, and then it says, in the latter years, and that literally means in the last years or in the last days, you will come into the land that's brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have always been laid waste, but is brought forth safely out of the nations. So what we're saying in English there is, in the last days, whenever they are, I'm going to show you that we are in the last days, a nation, which we haven't looked at yet because it's mentioned earlier in the chapter, is going to come against the mountains of Israel, and we know that it's at a certain point of time, because it says it is that Israel has been brought forth out of the nations and dwell safely, all of them. Now, why is that significant when it says they've been brought forth out of the nations?
Because they returned to their land.
They returned to their land. Now, what year did they return to their land?
1948.
1948, Israel was recreated, wasn't it? Now, when was the last time that Israel was a nation before 1948? AD 70. Nearly 2,000 years had gone by, and then in 1948, Israel is suddenly and miraculously recreated on planet Earth. That's a big sign, isn't it? So these events spoken about in Ezekiel 38, could they have happened before 1948? Well, they couldn't, because it says there that it's when they've been brought forth out of the nations and are living in the land. So whatever date this chapter is talking about, would you agree it must be after 1948? So after 2 millennia after Jesus walked on this earth, he says, look out for this, and when you see them actually in their land, there's a whole bunch of things that's going to happen, and all of this is leading up, as we said a few minutes ago, to the return of Jesus. Because God didn't have to tell us this, did he? God didn't actually have to say, let me tell you about events that are going to come leading up to the return of Christ. Why do you think he does do that? Why does God tell us about things that are happening just before Jesus comes back?
A witness to his existence, isn't it?
It's a witness to his existence, which helps us with what? Belief and faith. And what else?
So that we're ready for when Christ returns.
So we get ourselves ready. So we think, hold on a minute, I might have been doing this, I might have been focused on this, and I might have been enjoying that, but actually if it's all going to come to an end in terms of what we now know as life, and Jesus is going to intervene and return, then maybe I should re-examine, what I'm doing. Is that a fair point? To get us ready. But the question is, who is coming against Israel? How do we know it's Russia and some other nations? And we know that because in verse 1 of Ezekiel 38, it says, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince or the chief ruler of some places called Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, thus saith the Lord God, I'm against you, O Gog. Now, these aren't places that we know, are they? Because you wouldn't book a holiday to Meshech. You wouldn't book a holiday to Tubal. You wouldn't book a holiday to Magog. If you did, the travel agent would go, what are you talking about? You want to go on holiday to Magog? Don't know where you've got to go there. So why do you think these are places that we don't know? What's happened? Names have changed. Does that happen? Do names change?
Yeah.
Not that long ago, it wasn't the nation of Iran. What was it called? Persia. Names change. It doesn't happen every 5 minutes, but when was Ezekiel written, do you think? How long ago? Exactly, 500 or 600 years before Jesus, so that's 2,500 years ago. Well, a lot changes in 2,500 years. Would you have seen Great Britain on a map 2,500 years ago? Would you have seen Russia, Germany, France, Iran, America? Answer, no. Lots has changed in 2,500 years. So what do you think we have to do to try and know where Magog, Meshach and Tubal. Got it. That's all you can do, isn't it? You've got to go back and think, well, who was Ezekiel talking about? So you've got to go back to some ancient writings, some ancient maps, haven't you? That's the only way you could do it. And so when you do that, you come up with things like this. So you go. This is an ancient historian called Josephus that some of you may have heard of. He was living at the time of Jesus. He wasn't a Christian or anything like that, but he was an historian that many people recognise as being a well-respected and sort of unbiased person at that point, that wrote about many different events really that were concerning Israel. He lived in Israel, but he was an historian. Anyway, look what he says about Magog, because that's first place on the list. It says, Magog founded those that from him were called the Magogites, but who are by the Greeks called the Scythians. So what can if I'm believing Josephus, Magog, you could say, also equals who?
Syrian.
The Scythians. And the reason that that's interesting is because there are quite a few maps with where the Scythians lived. There aren't so many maps where Magog was. But the Scythians is helpful because Magog and the Scythians, he says, are one and the same. And as it turns out, they most certainly are. Now here's a pretty modern, up-to-date map of, this is just from an encyclopedia, where the Scythians were. And this big orange territory is where the Scythians lived. Now does anybody know what is the majority country that is covering?
Russia.
It's Russia. So Russia starts here. This is pretty much the most southern point of Russia. And of course Russia's enormous, it goes all the way over here somewhere. But this is all southern, what we would now call southern Russia. Amazingly, Scythia also went, you see the orange blob comes around here, and it comes into half of this country here. Can you see that? Ukraine. Which is a bit that Putin's trying to take back at the minute.
Ukraine, Eastern
This
Ukraine.
bit, he really likes this bit. There's Crimea, which is just annexed back into Russia. He likes this bit because really he's not doing it because it's part of Syria. But you know something? The people still correspond to these ancient territories. So when you go into Ukraine, the eastern part here generally are Russian speakers and are pro-Russian. These people here aren't. They're more pro-Europe, and that's where the division in Ukraine has come from, and Putin's taken advantage of that. But that's another story, yeah? So when it says, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, in our language that would be saying Gog of the land of, if you're being really accurate, southern Russia. And by the way, who does Gog sound like? Who do you think Gog is? When it says Gog of the land of Magog, I'm against you, O Gog, chief prince, chief ruler of, what does he sound like? Well, it could be Putin, and it certainly sounds like the ruler of the place, doesn't it? That's what I'm getting at. It sounds like the person who's running the show, whoever the ruler is, because it says, I'm against you, O Gog, set your face against him, prophesy against him. So there's a ruler of Magog, but there's two other places. What are they? Meshach and Tubal. Take my word for it, but there's some Schofield Reference Bible. There's an ancient historian called Herodotus who also talks about these places. These places are also identifiable within Russia. So Meshach is identifiable actually around the area that we now know as Moscow, and in fact they say that Meshach and Moscow are in effect derived from each other. So the reason that we now have Moscow as the capital is because it was in the area of Meshach, and that's the you can see there's almost a link between the words there, and there is in the Hebrew. And Tubal is this area out in the east of Russia, where the modern area would be called Tobolsk. And again, you can see there's a sort of link there. What God is saying is, look, there are three areas: there's Magog, Meshach, and Tubal. And the whole lot of it is describing what we would now call as the entire territory of Russia. In fact, when I looked at it, if God wanted to say modern day Russia, there were no three other nations that he could have picked out to describe Russia in its entirety, which is pretty amazing. Because even if you just left it as Magog, you could say, well, is it to do with the whole of Russia when they're up here now? But he picked out all these 3 places, and it then encompasses the whole nation, which is pretty amazing. So there is Ezekiel 38 that we've just been looking at. And God is against the rule of Russia, therefore. And in verse 4, it says, I'm going to turn you back. That literally means I'm going to restore you to power. I'm going to put hooks in your jaws. I'm going to bring you forth with your army, horses, horsemen. What could this be? Do you think Russia's going to come down on the back of horses? Tanks. If Ezekiel had written tanks, people would have gone, what? A tank? You've lost me. Right? So it's all talking about in language that every generation can understand. But we know that when Russia comes down, they will not be coming on horses. This is talking about a great army. And look at the nations that are with Russia when they invade. Persia, who's that? Iran. Can we see Iran lining up with Russia?
Yes.
Is that, have we? No, that can't possibly happen. What do we think? Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? 2,500 years later, Iran is most definitely squared up with Russia, would we say? Ethiopia and Libya with them. Now, these are very interesting places. That actually is more accurately North Sudan, which is it's another story. But effectively, Russia is heavily into North Sudan and the area around Ethiopia. And Libya, well, we've seen Gaddafi killed recently, a few years ago. And have you seen the news reports about Russia going into Libya and affecting things in there in the aftermath of that as well? So again, they're not totally strange things to think about, that these nations could also join forces. Goma and Togarmah are both areas of Turkey that we now know. And Turkey has very much come on board with Russia in recent months as well. And in the latter years, you're going to come, it says, into the land that's brought back from the sword against many people, against the mountains of Israel. So all this lot's going to happen. And it happens in the last years, in the last days. Now, what happens is, in the Bible, it happens in the New Testament, we know this, that you get... How many Gospels are there? There's 4 Gospels. Why has God given us 4 Gospels when really they're saying pretty much the same thing?
Because they've got a different slant on it.
They've got a slightly different slant on it. That's the best way of describing it. So Matthew comes at it with one slant. Mark and Luke and John will all come at it from a slightly different slant. They don't contradict each other, do they?
No.
But when you read it, you think, there's a little bit more detail from that wasn't there, but when I put the 2 together, it makes a bigger picture. Is that fair? There's probably other reasons as well, but I think that's a good reason. The same happens in the Old Testament with prophecy. So you don't just get it in one place. This story is told somewhere else. Is it worth looking at that?
Yes.
It is, because it gives you a bigger picture. So where is the other place in the Bible that we'd go to that gives us Daniel? And which chapter? 11. So Daniel chapter 11 looks like this. Now I'm going to read it, and you tell me if this doesn't quite sound very similar to this passage that we've just read in Ezekiel 38. Now, Daniel 11 is a very long chapter, and there's a whole chunk of it. We're going to dive straight in at around about verse 36. But, be that as it may, I'm not taking it out of context. I just want to read you this little passage here. Verse 36 of Daniel 11 starts off by saying the king, there's a ruler that does according to his will, and he exalts himself and magnifies himself. We'll look at more of that in just a second. But then it says in verse 40, now look at this. At the time of the end, the king of the south, whoever that is, shall push at him, this king that was talked about here, and the king of the north will come against the king of the south like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and enter into the countries and overflow them. He will enter into the glorious land. Many countries will be overthrown. Verse 42, he'll have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over the precious things of Egypt. and the Libyans and Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Can you see there's some things there that sound a little bit similar to Ezekiel 38? So I've colour-coded it. So here it says, at the time of the end, the king of the south is going to push at a particular individual, and the king of the north then comes out like with his army. And I'm saying to you that the phrase "the time of the end" is very similar to this phrase here, which says it's in the last days or the latter years. Fair enough? It talks here about the king of the north coming down, and it talks here in verse 6 about them coming from the north quarters. Whatever it is, they're north of Israel. That seems to seem the same. This says that this army comes down with chariots and horsemen and many ships. This says all your army and horsemen and a great company. It doesn't mention ships, that's a new bit of detail, but you can see it's a big army. We're just told a little bit more. Where do you think, when it says that this man comes into the glorious land, where do you think the glorious land might be? It's almost categorically a reference to Israel, because throughout the Old Testament, Israel is referred on a number of occasions as being the glorious land. It's God's land, isn't it? Does that tie in with this? They're coming against the mountains of Israel. And finally, you've got the Libyans and Ethiopians with this army that's coming from the north. Well, we've got a northern army here, and Ethiopia and Libya are with them. This one doesn't say Iran, but that doesn't mean Iran isn't there. This is one of these jigsaw puzzles that I was telling you about, where you put it all together. There isn't one passage that tells you everything. There's two passages that tell you different bits, and you've got to do that with it. Does that make sense? Happy so far?
Yeah.
So anybody think that these aren't the same event? Looks to me like it's the same event. It's either, if it's a different event, it's almost identical to that other event. And the chance of it all being two big invasions of Israel, and it doesn't really, and the Ethiopians and Libyans have another get, it doesn't make sense. Not when it's all happening at the time of the end, it doesn't. Now here's the thing. In Ezekiel 38, it tells us about this man that the Bible calls Gog. Now Gog is the title that was given to the leader of the Magagites. Yeah? So just as, we have a president, or you might have a king, or whatever it might be. In the time of Magog, when it did exist, the ruler was called Gog. It means somebody that's like a mountain, somebody that's high above everybody else. That's what Gog actually means. So anyway, there's Gog, and God is against this person, this individual person who's ruling over Russia. Now, I'm suggesting that this is exactly the same passage over here, but with more detail. And I'm going to prove to you in just 2 seconds that the king that's spoken about here in verse 36 to 39, that is all magnified and puffed up, that at the time of the end the king of the south pushes at, because you notice it says at the time of the end the king of the south shall push at him. Who is the him?
Gog.
It's got to be Gog. It's got to be this king of verse 36 to 39. This is an individual human being on planet Earth that exists at the time of the end. It doesn't say he pushes at a nation, it says an individual man. And God says, I'll tell you all about this man. And the man that God tells us all about is the same man that he's mentioned here in the verses. That you see how it all lines up. There's Gog, there's Gog. There's time of the end, there's latter years, and so on and so forth. So there's an individual person. So we're going to have a look now, because amazingly God has given us a lot of details about this man that exists at the time of the end. Here he is. This is in a modern version, because I think it's just helpful when you're decoding it all. So this is what this man who lives at the time of the end, this is all the info we know about him in this chapter. In fact, there is another chapter in Daniel that we could look at that gives us even more information, but this is enough to be going on with. This is what God says, and he says to us, we better look out for this man. The king will do as he pleases, exalting himself and claiming to be greater than every god, even blaspheming the God of gods. He will succeed, but only until the time of wrath is completed. For what has been determined will surely take place. He will have no respect for the God of his ancestors, or for the God loved by women, or for any other god, for he will boast that he is greater than them all. Instead of these, he will worship the God of armed forces, and a God his ancestors never knew will he worship with gold, silver, precious stones, and expensive gifts. He will work in the strongest fortress. He will honour those who submit to him, appointing them to positions of authority and dividing the land among them as their reward. Then, at the time of the end, the king of the south will provoke him. The authorised version says push at him. Then the king of the north will storm out with chariots and a vast navy. So we're given quite a lot of detail about somebody that's existing at the time of the end, and I'm saying that this is the Russian leader. So I'm going to pull out all these phrases and put them next to the current Russian leader, and let's see how we get on. Alright? So the first thing that we're told is that this is a man that exalts himself. Right? Now, I would say there aren't many other leaders that have got their own calendar and that are doing this type of thing and promoting themselves in this way. I never saw Cameron doing this. I did see him with some shorts on Bournemouth Beach once, but he wasn't running around with an AK-47 and jumping out of planes and doing all this sort of stuff. Neither did David Cameron or Theresa May, or in fact any other world leader that I know of at the moment, have their own youth camp. So this is a youth group. It's a shadowy movement really within Russia, where young people come in and are indoctrinated to worship Vladimir Putin. They're called, believe it or not, the Narshis, which is got a few overtones of goodness knows what else. But this is pretty amazing stuff. You know, these are young people being trained to follow this man, and this isn't just a few people. There are thousands and thousands of young people going through these boot training camps, all about that's a picture of him on all their t-shirts. That's his face on their t-shirts. And Narshi means ours. So when they've got a picture of Putin's face, Narshi underneath in Russian, which literally means ours, is saying he's ours. You know, we are his. This was a panorama program last year, and they were focusing in on Putin. Now, Panorama, you might like it, you might not, but I think it's probably a pretty good investigative, journalistic BBC programme. Pretty well respected and known around the world. This is what they say about Putin.
There is no other world leader like Vladimir Putin. Action man. Man of the people.
Да здравствует Россия!
And ruler of Russia.
Владимир Путин приветствует экипаж морского тральщика.
From Ukraine to Syria, Vladimir Putin's influence is being felt. He's faced countless accusations of corruption, but still has record
approval ratings, I should say. So look, there's not many other world leaders you can display in that sort of way, is there? And in fact, the previous, remember Mikhail Gorbachev, this was in the Telegraph a few months ago, Mikhail Gorbachev says Vladimir Putin views himself as second only to God. What did we read? This man exalts himself, even seeing himself as greater than other gods and magnifying himself in his heart. So I think, well, maybe there's a few rulers we might think are a bit like that, but he's definitely ticking that box. It also says he worships the God of armed forces, and there's no shadow of a doubt that who can dispute that Putin has not worshipped the God of armed forces. He literally has thrown so much extra money into the Russian army, it's taken it from a pretty useless place into a mean, lean fighting machine. I mean, he's managed to blow the minds of military analysts in the way that he's managed to conduct thousands of miles away pretty intense operations in Syria on a daily basis. They had no idea Russia was really capable of that, because you've got to get the supply lines through, you've got to keep the infrastructure going, and he has single-handedly turned it around. But you also remember it said that he worshipped gold, silver, and I think it said in the modern version, expensive gifts. This man, when it says he worships them, it doesn't just mean he puts them on the mantelpiece. This is saying this is what drives him. This is what his focus is. It's upon cash, it's upon gold, it's upon silver, it's upon expensive gifts. And again, last year in January, there were these allegations, again through Panorama, that were saying actually Putin could not only be the richest man in Europe, he may well be the richest man on the entire planet with the amount of money that's been siphoned out of Russia into his bank account personally, which is pretty amazing stuff. This guy really does worship riches. He's had an enormous palace built for himself. It's empty at the minute, but that's where he's going to move into if and when he does retire. The other thing is, it says, do you remember it says he works in a fortress? The authorised version says a stronghold. Stronghold and fortress, the same word. Look at this. The Kremlin means a fortress inside a city. He is the only leader on the planet that literally does work in a fortress. The Bible says this man will work in a fortress. The Kremlin means fortress. He is working in a fortress. 10 Downing Street is not a fortress. The White House is not a fortress. This man is working in a fortress. Big tick in the box there. The last bit I was going to show you, which is the last thing God says about this man, is that he will honour those who submit to him, appointing them to positions of authority and dividing the land among them as their reward. Now this is amazing, because this came out last year. I'm going to show you another Panorama programme on Putin in just a second, but remember these words. Russian ruler will honour those who submit to him. He appoints them to positions of authority, and he divides the land among them as their reward. This language is almost identical, word for word, in the Panorama programme aired last year that I'm going to play you now. Really listen for that. Listen out for those words.
He's the world leader accused of personally approving murder on the streets of London.
The conclusion that the Russian state was probably involved in the murder of Mr. Litvinenko is deeply disturbing.
But is the president implicated in an assassination also responsible for theft on an extraordinary scale?
He has fleets of things that almost no billionaire in the West would have.
Vladimir Putin has been accused of looting his own country.
Today, Putin behaves like a czar.
Tonight, we investigate the truth about President Putin's riches.
Why would it be kept secret? Because it belongs personally to Putin, not to the state.
And for the first time, the Americans say what they really think about the Russian president.
Is Vladimir Putin corrupt?
In our view, yes.
The men closest to Putin have been with him for years. They were with him here in St. Petersburg, and they've stayed with him ever since. And this is the group that he trusts and that he rewards. And this is the group that runs Russia. Putin's lawyer at the town hall became president and then prime minister of Russia. His former deputy also served as prime minister. The chief of staff at the town hall now runs Russia's anti-drugs agency. His former assistant now runs the biggest oil company in the world. And his former economist now runs the biggest gas company in the world. For those who've been in Putin's circle, the benefits have been immense. A cellist who is godfather to Putin's daughter has a valuable stake in a major Russian bank. A neighbor has an even bigger stake. Another neighbor ended up running the railways. A childhood friend has made a fortune from government contracts. And his brother has made even more. Americans say this is how Putin's Russia works.
Pretty interesting, don't you think? When God had said, look out for this man ruling Russia, and what did it say? Will honour those who submit to him, appointing them to positions of authority and dividing the land among them as their reward. This is him. We're on to him. Then, at the time of the end, something's going to happen. The king of the south, whoever that is, pushes him, or as this version says, provokes him. There's a provocation of the king of the south against an individual man. You see why this is now getting sort of more interesting, don't you think? So the question then is, who is the king of the south? We now know we're talking about Gog. We now know we're talking about Russia. Who is the king of the south? It doesn't tell us who the king of the south is in Daniel 11, but guess where it does tell us who the king of the south is? Ezekiel 38. And Ezekiel 38 tells us the opposing force to Russia. And it's there in, if you're still open, have a look at Ezekiel 38. It's in this chapter, and it's the opposing force to Russia. And it's in verse 13 of Ezekiel 38. And it says in Ezekiel 38, verse 13, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions, will say to you, Gog, art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered this great company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, and to take away cattle and goods, and to take a great spoil? So there's a group of nations that say, wait a minute, Russia, what are you doing? Why are you invading Israel? What on earth is happening? And the nations that are listed out there are Sheba, Dedan, merchants of Tarshish, and young lions. Well, these aren't real young lions. It's not like a bunch of lions that are literally going to do something. This is very quickly the interpretation of who those are. Sheba and Dedan, if you look on ancient maps, are in the area of where? Saudi Arabia. So if you look on ancient maps, which I haven't got time to do, go and type in Sheba and Dedan into Google. Where were they in ancient times? They were in Saudi Arabia, amazingly, mainly around northern Saudi Arabia, covering what we now call the Gulf states. So states like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates and Oman. And that is really the key area of Sheba and Dedan. So you've got Sheba and Dedan, but you've got who also in relation to Sheba and Dedan? Who is next on the list? Tarshish. Where is Tarshish? Britain. Britain is Tarshish in the Bible. So this is weird because Britain's over here somewhere and it's saying Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Britain and the young lions. Who are the young lions, do you think? The offspring of Britain, the old lion. We are the old lion. They are the, we've always been depicted as the old lion, even on old posters. And the young lions are the offspring nations from this country, like America, like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand. And anyway, but if you look on a modern map, and this is a very modern map, look what it's showing you here in terms of our bases that we have in Saudi Arabia. These Gulf states are not anti-Britain and anti... Where was Theresa May this week? Where did she go? Saudi Arabia. She's doing deals because now Brexit has happened. Where does she rush off to? She rushes here because we've got amazingly close ties. I was reading up about this yesterday because I wondered why we got such close ties with Saudi Arabia, and it's all to do with the First World War. Well, Ezekiel wrote a long time before the First World War, but that's when our ties with Saudi Arabia really got welded together because we made lots of agreements with them. Which is another story. But so effectively, the king of the south, when the king of the south is mentioned in Daniel chapter 11, if we go back there, it says at the time of the end, the king of the south will provoke this particular man. The king of the south is who? Saudi Arabia, Britain, America. The most powerful out of all of those would be who? America. Now what I did, I look at this verse and I say, well actually, if that is the case, I can now unlock pretty much this whole verse now into English. And this is how I've done it. At the time of the end, the King of the South power, the US and UK based in Saudi Arabia, will militarily provoke, because that's what this word push means. When it says that the King of the South pushes, it literally means to gore or to aggravate, or it doesn't mean to finish off. It means to really wind up, and it's got a military context in it as well. So there's a military provocation of go Vladimir Putin. Then it says the King of the North will storm out with all its war machine, including its vast navy. Because what happens when he's being provoked is that then Russia, the King of the North power, then down it comes. So it's no longer an individual thing. He says, right, the might of the King of the North, my northern powerhouse, is coming down against you. Now this week, and I've been watching for this for such a long time, that's why I've got to get it off my chest. The point is, all this time, we're waiting to see the provocation of Putin. Right? And it's been rumbling along for weeks and months now, hasn't it? Since Obama stepped down, there's been all this hoo-ha, hasn't there, in America over Putin influencing the American elections. And now, this week, we see Trump order strikes straight into Syria, which Putin is controlling, isn't he? Yeah. He has now got Syria in his hands, and suddenly America's come in. Now, I'm going to play you the rest of that clip that I started off with earlier on, and have a look at this, because they start talking about some of the implications of what comes next.
On board Air Force One.
I think what happened in Syria is a disgrace to humanity. And he's there, and I guess he's running things. So something should happen.
The attack killed at least 4 Syrian soldiers, including a general, and took out a dozen hangars, a fuel depot and air defences.
It was a crime that called out for a swift response. And today the United States has responded.
The Tomahawk cruise missiles, almost 3 metres long, fly low at 1,000 kilometres an hour, cost $750,000 each. They are the US weapon of choice to attack from safe distances. But there are grave implications now for Allied military in and over Syria, including Australia's F-18 Hornets. RAAF operations have not been suspended.
We've taken all of that into account in terms of our own force protection.
The question now, how will Syria's key backer Russia respond? Their relationship with the US now appears terminal.
This has got to be one of the last nails, if not the last nail, in the coffin.
The US and Russia endured decades of Cold War, everyone now praying a hot war isn't sparked.
Good night, and God bless America and the entire world. Thank you.
Donald Trump has just intervened in the most complex civil war on the planet. There's no talk of a full-scale ground war. He's repeatedly rejected that, but there will be fallout. Already, the Kremlin has called for an urgent UN Security Council meeting. It has condemned this action as an act of aggression. Russia has bases, personnel and jets on the ground in Syria. Also on the ground there, hundreds of American troops. Today's strike on the Syrian airbase could trigger retaliation on them.
Russia said this morning that we are within an inch of war with America. And in fact, Boris Johnson, this was literally this morning, Boris Johnson, who of course is our Foreign Secretary, this was the headline. It says, Boris Johnson to spearhead diplomatic drive to get Russian forces out of Syria. This is going to go down really well, isn't it, with Putin? Vladimir Putin will be told to pull troops from Syria and drop support for President Assad in a UK-US plan being spearheaded by Boris Johnson. Mr. Johnson cancelled plans to visit Moscow just hours before he was due to fly. This was yesterday. I don't know whether you saw this. He was about to get on, literally about to get on the plane when it was decided there's no point anymore talking to Russia, cancel the trip, and instead we need to build up support to get Russia out of Syria. The other interesting thing on this, and this was a weekly World Watch slide that I did yesterday, world response to US strike reflects divide over Syria, and this is abbreviated, but basically Reuters went through all of the different nations and how they line up or not against what America has done. Saudi Arabia, a foreign ministry official praised the courageous decision by America, President Donald Trump. Does that work out? Do we expect Saudi Arabia and America to be on side?
Yeah.
From Bible, tick. Other Gulf countries, the UAE, which hosts some 4,000 American troops, said the US had its full support and praised Trump's courageous and wise decision. Does that work? Tick. Iran's foreign ministry said that the US strike was dangerous, destructive and violates the principles of international law. Does that work? Exactly, there's Persia. Hezbollah, it's a foolish strike, could lead to a dangerous escalation in the region. Britain, the British government said it was informed in advance about the American missile strikes and firmly supports the American action. Does that work? And NATO also at the moment is supporting that. But you can see just how amazing everybody's lining up very quickly over what's going on there. At some point, this is in verse 10 of Ezekiel 38, it says, "You, Gog, will think an evil thought, and you will say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages, Israel, to take a spoil and to take a prey." There is absolutely no doubt, at some point or other, this man is coming down into Israel. There's lots of verses in the Bible that talk about it, not only Ezekiel 38, but that's what we've just looked at. And of course, what do Britain and America and Saudi Arabia say when Russia comes down? What's the phrase that they say?
Oh, they'll come to take a spoil.
Have you come to take a spoil? And it could well be that this is one of the people who says those exact words. What on earth, I didn't realise this was going to happen. What are you doing? Have you come to take a spoil? The very last thing I was just going to show you is that the whole situation in Syria is another prophecy that's running along the side. And in Isaiah 17, it says Damascus is going to be removed from being a city and will become a fallen ruin. That hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen. It also says that northern Israel is going to be destroyed and the royal power of Damascus will end. And so there is something soon going to happen where this man, I believe, will bring Israel into the conflict. And that's when Israel becomes sort of involved in all of this, because it's not really involved at the minute, but it will. And all this hoo-ha with Syria right now, and this tension, is fast approaching a great cataclysmic event that sees the Damascus, which is the oldest continually inhabited city on planet Earth, according to Wikipedia, finally comes to a complete and utter end. That's where these strikes by Trump are going to lead. And wasn't it interesting when he said at the end of his speech, God bless America and the entire world. This isn't just about America and Syria. This isn't just about Russia and us. This is about the entire world could get impacted with these things. And in Isaiah 17, after Syria's total demise, that's when Russia does come down, and it says that they're like a great big roaring sea that comes down. It says the armies of many nations roar like the roaring of the sea, hear the thunder of the mighty forces as they rush forward like the thundering waves. Russia's army, when it comes down, and it's got over 1 million troops and goodness knows how many tanks and aeroplanes, when they come down, it will be looking like that. But as we said at the start, last two slides, at the end of the day, all this is about is one simple thing, and that is God telling us in advance that Jesus is coming back. Get yourself ready, shake your mind free of all the stuff that you're worrying about, because everything's about to change. All nations will be gathered against Jerusalem to battle. That is going to happen. But in that day, somebody's feet are going to stand upon the Mount of Olives. Whose feet do you think are going to touch down on the Mount of Olives? They are the feet of the Lord Jesus Christ, because he will intervene in this cataclysmic, terrifying war that we're fast approaching to. And I tell you something, if he didn't, what would be the outcome?
No flesh saved alive on the earth.
No flesh saved. The whole lot would finish. And you could imagine that, couldn't you now? Especially with Trump and Putin in power, because they'll both go to the death, wouldn't they? None of them will back down. That's why Trump's there. He's not
one
some...
of them knows what he's really doing.
Yeah. And look what happens then, and this is the bit that we should remember. When Jesus does come back, the Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day there will be one Lord. There'll be no more utter destruction, like we're going to see, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. So even though all this might seem pretty scary, and to some extent it is, even believing in all of this, you can still feel, oh my goodness, the whole world is about to change. However, if we're on side with God, and if He's told us in advance these things are going to happen, and He's doing it so that we're ready for when Christ comes back, we will be taken to be with Him, as we looked at last Monday, and that is our hope. Without God right now, then actually, make the most of it, because there isn't a great deal of time, I do not think, left now for us to, eat, drink and be merry. Because when this thing really does start, everything is going to change.